All right, our last part in chapter 14. So this is water pollution. This one's a little bit longer than the other two sections, but it shouldn't be too bad. This one I think is the most interesting because this is where it really connects to every day. 3,800 children die every day from diseases associated with unsafe drinking water. Worldwide, these things, a lot of them include diarrheal illnesses, things like giardia. It can also include things that we would commonly call like the stomach flu, that kind of thing. But when you don't have safe drinking water, you can get all these kinds of things from that water. There we go. So types of water pollution. We have two main categories that all pollution is going to fall into. So point source pollution. This is where the pollution is coming from a discrete location, from like a single source. So for example, here we have this point source pollution coming from like something that's going into the water here, a factory, a sewer pipe, something like that. Non-point source is from many places spread over a large area. So that would be like when snowmelt runoff picks up pollution along its path, or when rainwater picks up fertilizer as it goes over the farmland in Iowa, for instance. So non-point source pollution is going to be larger areas, not from one specific source. We're going to talk about a couple different categories of pollution. So first is nutrient pollution. Nutrient pollution is usually caused by a couple of different nutrients specifically. So typically excess phosphorus. You can also get excess nitrogen that can also be part of this. And then there's a couple other ones in the water that can do this. And those nutrients are the same ones that you might find in fertilizers. And so what happens is the nutrient pollution is basically like fertilizing the water. Nutrients build up in the water, and then the things that do photosynthesis, just like your plants, the algae and aquatic plants will grow. They can grow very rapidly because they have all these nutrients. Now, eventually, they will run out of space. In the water column, typically you have, the surface, and that's where we can get sunlight. And a lot of times this like population boom will cause too many algae to grow. And so some of them will be underneath in shadow, and then they can't get any more sun and they can die. Other things can happen. Other organisms can die also because they're getting all the space is being taken over by the plants. But plants are usually going to be our first things that die, either aquatic plants or algae. And then decomposition begins to happen, and the bacteria that do decomposition will require oxygen. As they use up the oxygen in the water, there's less and less dissolved oxygen available in the water. And we don't normally think about like fish as needing oxygen, needing to breathe, but they do. They do it in a different way than we do. They have gills, not lungs, right? But they still need that O2. And so if you have the bacteria here decomposing our dead algae and they're using up all that oxygen, you don't have enough oxygen in the water column for things like fish. So as those dissolved oxygen levels decrease, you can get zones where all the like fish have died, hypoxic zones. All right, so that is called eutrophication, this whole process. It's caused by nutrient pollution, but the process is called eutrophication. And when we talk about it because of like excess fertilizer runoff from farms, this would be cultural eutrophication. Now, some eutrophication will happen naturally. It's part of the natural cycle of seasons in many places. As like snow melts comes down into the rivers, it'll bring more nutrients at that time during the early spring, that time of year. But usually cultural eutrophication is much worse because there are more nutrients suddenly available in the water than would happen in like a natural environment. All right, next is toxic chemicals. This is what we commonly think of when we think water pollution. We think of someone dumping chemicals in the lake or the river. This occurs when harmful chemicals are released into waterways. It can be either organic or inorganic. And these chemicals harm ecosystems, they cause human health problems, and it really depends on what the toxin is. We're actually going to talk about a couple different chemicals. You're going to watch a few like documentaries over the next couple of weeks, because this kind of realm we kind of will shift into like climate change and other environmental issues for the end of the year. But yeah, like the specific toxin is going to matter here because different toxins are going to cause different effects. For example, in Flint, Michigan, the toxin that we're dealing with is lead. Lead is going to cause very specific effects. It's going to cause like certain kinds of issues with brain development in young children. It can also cause problems with bone growth because of how that lead ion can take the place of calcium ions in the brain and in the bone. Other kinds of things can cause other problems. There's a couple things that have caused issues in other communities that cause things like cancer, PCBs, or different like components of Teflon that got in water sources that end up showing higher rates of cancer in communities. So it depends on what the toxin is, what the cause is going to be. All right, next is sediment and thermal pollution. These things we don't normally think of as pollution, so this is kind of an interesting area. So sediment pollution is when you have unusually large amounts of sediment, which is basically like dirt, that changes the aquatic environment. So imagine you have a beautiful pond, you can see through to the bottom, and suddenly you get construction nearby. And the construction removes a bunch of plants, which causes increased levels of erosion, which means that you have a bunch of dirt that ends up in the pond. Suddenly, the visibility in the pond changes. So fish that may have been in there and happy because they could see are no longer happy. It could be detrimental to their health in a number of ways because of that sediment. So sediment pollution is going to result from erosion. So kind of think back to that agriculture chapter. We talked about a lot of ways to prevent erosion. Those things are also going to prevent sediment pollution. It can degrade water quality. It can cause photosynthesis rates to decline because if you have more sediment in the water, there's not enough sunlight going through. The water is more murky, so photosynthesis can't happen as far into the water column. And it can, because it's causing photosynthesis rates to decrease, it can therefore disrupt the food web. It can change the food web if you don't have enough at the bottom of that food web, that pyramid. Next is thermal pollution. Thermal pollution is where you have a heat source that raises temperature. A lot of times the heated water is actually water that is being used to cool machinery at factories. And so this water may not ever come in contact with anything like toxic or that we would normally think of as a problem because it's going on like the outside of the equipment or next to machinery to kind of help cool it down. But when you add the water back into the river or the lake and it's warmed up, it holds less oxygen. So already you're going to have decreased levels of oxygen. Plus, it can change the type of animals that might be there. They've had issues in certain areas in Florida where manatees will actually hang out near power plants because of the thermal pollution. And then they don't ever migrate to where they're supposed to go. And so they can like starve over winter because they can't get enough good food there because it's too cold nearby and there's not enough like vegetation growing during that time of year. So thermal pollution can be a problem for some animals if it disrupts things like that life cycle. All right, next is biological pollution. So I kind of mentioned this at the very beginning with Giardia, which is one of those diarrheal illnesses that can come from the water. It's the most common form of waterborne disease in the U.S. There's also cholera bacteria. Any biological pollution or biological pathogen in the waterway can cause disease. It causes more human health problems than any other form of water pollution. And that's because a lot of the time these are the pathogens that have been like evolved with human as their like host. And so they're going to get people sick. They come from people and they're going to get people sick. Water treatment reduces biological pollution, so it gets rid of a lot of this stuff. When you turn on the tap water in your house, you can expect that there's not going to be cholera or Giardia in there. They do a lot of testing. They are going to remove that. And so if you don't have water treatment, if you don't have that infrastructure in a country or in a city, you're going to have higher rates of these diseases. All right, groundwater pollution. So groundwater pollution could fall into some of these other categories too, like it could be a chemical pollutant, it could be nutrients, whatever it could be many different categories of pollution. But if it reaches into the groundwater, then it is groundwater pollution. Typically, we think of this mostly with the toxic chemicals, because if you have nutrients that go into the groundwater, but there's no sunlight, you're not going to get that same like growth of photosynthetic creatures because there's no sunlight. The same thing if you get like bacteria in the groundwater, a lot of times they're not going to be able to survive long term in the groundwater. So a lot of times when we're talking about groundwater, we're talking about these chemical pollutants, things that are resulting from the surface pollutants leaching through the soil as it rains and as the rainwater brings those pollutants through the soil and into the aquifer. It could also come from a leaky underground source. So it could come from a source underground that is leaking water, so like a landfill or something like that, or a septic tank. Chemicals break down more slowly in groundwater than in surface water. And again, that's because you're not going to have the organisms living in groundwater that you do in surface water. There's just not as many things that can survive. And most efforts to reduce groundwater pollution are going to focus on prevention. It's very hard to clean it up. The EPA repairs and replaces leaky underground gas storage tanks to reduce groundwater pollution each year. Over the last 25 years, over 1.7 million tanks have been repaired or replaced, but even that is not going to completely solve the problem. Like, it's going to have to continue, because what happens is as the tanks age, more and more of them can become leaky. A lot of places where we have this like leaching into the groundwater have been named Superfund sites. And so they can do a bunch of different things to mitigate the groundwater pollution and try to keep the pollution from getting into the groundwater if it hasn't already. So there's a lot of different options that they have for containing that. Our picture here, we're looking at acid drainage from a coal mine. So when we talked about mining, we talked about how a lot of the things that are mined will have different chemicals as part of it. And by chemical, we mean like different elements combined with other things, right? So you might have like sulfur in the rock, and so the sulfur can combine and become sulfuric acid. And so you get this decrease in the pH of the drainage from the mines. All right, ocean water pollution. So this is oil pollution in the ocean. There's a couple different areas of ocean water pollution. So we'll talk about oil pollution first. So because that's the picture here, right? Oil pollution comes from many widely spread small sources. So there's lots and lots of natural seeps that are putting tiny bits of oil into the ocean. That is the largest single source if you added them all up. However, those natural seeps are small amounts of oil. And because of that, they're not going to cause like lasting damage to any one ecosystem. The big problems are when we have oil spills like in this picture, or like the Deepwater Horizon spill. These oil spills put out lots and lots of oil over a relatively short time, and the organisms there cannot deal with it. So they get covered in oil, they can't fly away if they're birds. It causes a big problem for lots of animals when there's that much oil at once. According to the U.S. Oil Pollution Act of 1990, by 2015, all oil tankers in U.S. waters must have double hulls to help prevent against leaks. And we have seen decreases in the number of spills, large spills from boats. Many of our more recent oil spills have been at the site of extraction, like the Deepwater Horizon. And that's not to say that there are none, because of course the U.S. is not the only people transporting oil. But we are one of the largest users, so we do have some sway over the oil companies. Another thing is mercury. You can get mercury into the ocean water, and then the organisms will bioaccumulate that mercury. So mercury can be come out from like power plants, and then you can get that mercury bioaccumulating, and so it goes up the food chain. So your smallest organisms have a little bit, and then eventually at the top of the food chain, your organisms have a lot. There's also plastic pollution in the ocean, which I forgot to add to the slide. So little tiny bits of plastic floating in the ocean. They can break down some by sunlight, but they don't ever completely break down. They're not like biodegradable, and they're not like edible. And so what happens is fish will ingest them while they're ingesting other stuff. And then these little tiny micro pellets of plastic can clog up fish gills if they are like swimming past these tiny bits. They can be accumulated in a fish stomach. They can cause lots of different problems. And we all, of course, saw the turtle with the straw up his nose, which was very, very sad. But plastics in general are a problem, not necessarily just straws. The other thing we can have is nutrient pollution can cause red tides. So that same nutrient pollution that causes eutrophication can actually cause blooms in dinoflagellates, which are these red algae that will also produce a toxin. And so the red tide can actually, it's this conglomeration of dinoflagellates, and some of these will produce a toxin that can actually kill fish. So when you have a red tide, the water will actually be a little bit darker in color, like it's not going to be your blue and green. It can look actually a little red from all of the algae if there's enough. And then you can get fish kills associated with it too, which is really a big negative for that, because what happens is you get too many toxins and the fish can't live in the water. All right, so controlling water pollution. Finished with all the depressing stuff. Now let's talk about how we're going to make sure this doesn't happen. The government regulation can decrease water pollution. So we've got a couple things. We've got the Clean Water Act, and it has specific guidelines. So it sets water pollution standards. So that's like how much of certain pollutants can be in the water. It requires permits if you're releasing point source pollution of any kind. And it funds sewage treatment plant construction. So it helps with sewage treatment as well. So the Great Lakes show that humans can change their ways and clean up trouble spots. In the 1970s, Lake Erie was declared dead. It didn't have like almost anything living in it, but it's now home to some flourishing species, especially the walleye, because of trying to not put this pollution into that water system. All right, and then water treatment. And of course, there are other laws associated with the Clean Water Act and lots of other statutes along with it, but all I want you guys to know is the like basics. All right, so water treatment. We have two main categories. Drinking water is going to be treated before you consume it to remove pollution of any kind. Typically, there's not going to be too much in the water that we're getting, but depending on where you're getting the water from, it may be coming from a natural source. If you're drinking water, which most of it is coming from either from a surface water source, which has higher rates of organisms, so a lake, a reservoir, a pond, a river, if the drinking water comes from there, it's going to have to be treated at minimum to reduce fecal coliform. And then there's usually other stuff in there that we don't want to ingest. That's just coming from the environment. Now, the fecal coliform is always going to be there, and it's not necessarily a bad thing or indicative of a bad thing in the environment, because like animals go to the bathroom. You're going to have fecal bacteria in any natural water source. This is why you don't want to just go out on a hike and drink the water you see on the side of the trail. If there's a stream there, don't drink it. It has fecal coliform bacteria in it, and it can make you sick if there's enough. So drinking water is going to be treated to remove the pollution before we drink it. Obviously, we don't want to get sick, right? And this is, of course, in places that have access to fresh, clean water. Wastewater is treated to remove pollution before it is released back into the environment. So wastewater is going to be treated so that we can release it back into the environment without causing a lot of nutrient pollution. There have been instances where people just put wastewater, like sewage, just straight into the ocean. This happened in a bay in Hawaii, and it completely destroyed it when they went from having like not too many people living there to suddenly they had like lots of military staff on that island during World War II. And it caused huge amounts of eutrophication. So tons of algal growth, fish kills, all sorts of bad things. They have since, of course, built sewage treatment, which means that the water that's released back into the environment does not contain all of that like fecal matter. So it doesn't contain all the nutrients, and it also doesn't contain bacteria. So they've started to see this bay return to what it used to have been like, or it used to be. All right, so the picture here is actually a septic system. In Atlanta, probably all of you are on sewage, not septic. But if you had a septic system, sewage enters the pipe through the inlet. Bacteria will break down the waste, and a sewage treatment plant does these kind of steps too. It's just not in one tank in someone's yard. So first, bacteria break down waste. They begin to do that process as soon as the sewage enters into the septic tank. Denser wastes that break down more slowly will sink to the bottom of the tank just by gravity. And this sludge must be pumped out of the tank. This is why if you have a septic system or a septic tank, it's got to be pumped between every 5 to 10 years. Less dense waste that break down slowly can build up on top. That scum has to be pumped out regularly as well. So you've got 2 areas that we're going to have to pump out. And then water and waste that has been broken down can travel to a gravel field through the outlet pipe. So you can get some of that sewage or sewage water traveling into this gravel field through the outlet pipe, and then eventually it can get back into the environment. But if the septic tank is working properly, it should be at least partially broken down before it does that. All right, that is it for water pollution and what we're doing to stop it. So this is it for the chapter 14 notes. Enjoy.